whatever we want to say, that what we want to do first is listen to what the other person has to say. Slow to speak. And we discussed how we can kind of process, be more willing to process what people say, listen to what people say before we jump in and talk. And then the idea of being slow to anger, that the only way, or an ideal way to making sure we're slow to anger, especially in any sort of relationship, husband, wife, friends, whatever, is practicing the first two. Being ready to hear first, being slower to speak, because then that will keep the anger kind of at bay, as that's kind of just the way it works. Then we began to talk about how God communicates, and I think that's kind of where we ended up. We're going to kind of go back through some of that a little bit, but first, let's have a prayer. Can I put you on the spot and lead us in prayer? Zach's going to lead us in a prayer. Any prayer requests this morning?
Pray for a guy named Hunter Hickey, that his heart will be open to God and he will want to become a Christian.
Hunter Hickey?
Hunter Hickey.
Friend of yours, family?
He's my sister's boyfriend, so they're kind of at this isn't for you, then we can't be together, so it's kind of heartbreaking.
Yeah. Jessica's boyfriend, I guess? Yeah. That would be your sister, huh? Hunter Hickey, that's the prayer request, that he'll be open to the truth. What else?
My parents are flying to Washington next weekend to move my grandparents to Naples.
Oh, yeah. Art and Vicky traveling, moving grandparents back this direction, all the joys that go around that, all the challenges. John and Rebecca and the family is traveling on a giant road trip. Sounds exciting, more or less. They're in Wyoming or North Dakota, South Dakota, or somewhere now. So follow John's adventures on Facebook. He's giving us updates. I'm going to embarrass these two back here. The lovely new couple back here. Robert and Jennifer Oldham, as of Friday. Very exciting. Now, I guess Chelsea's sitting next to him. I guess they'd throw her in there too and embarrass her too. Just take out the whole family at once. What else? Okay, nothing else.
Dear God, thank you for everything you've given us, and I thank you for this time that we're able to come together and just fellowship and learn more about you and focus into your word. And I pray that you be with the class today and help us to all be engaged, and I pray that you help us to provide input and learn from Clint today and from what he's prepared. And we also have a couple prayer requests we want to lift up to you, Lord. We pray that you be with Hunter Hickey and that you just open his heart and open into you, Lord, and to what you can offer him. I pray that you be with those close in his life right now and help him during this time as he's trying to open to you. I pray that you just be with those around him. I also pray that you be with the Clarks and the McCarthys and the McCormicks and just everyone that's traveling right now, Lord. I know that there's a lot of people on the road during this time of year, and I pray that you keep them safe and watch over them. And I also want to lift up the Oldhams, and I thank you that they were able to make it through all their travels and all the excitement in their life right now. I pray that you comfort them and just encourage them during this time of transitioning that's going on. We thank you for that. And again, we just thank you for the opportunity to come together and to learn more about you. It's in your son's name that we pray. Amen.
Yeah. Okay, if you want to open your Bibles to Psalm 19, we'll kind of look at that briefly again. We talked about the fact that we have to, the necessity of us working on our communication stems from the fact that, go back to Genesis 1:26, that we're made in God's image. And God has always been a communicator. In Psalm 19, you look at the first 6 verses compared to the next verses, beginning in verse 7. Verses 1 through 6 talk about God's general revelation. What is that all about? What is God's general revelation?
Nature.
It's nature. That just look around. Look at God's power. Look at creation. Look at thunderstorms. as much as it's been devastating, look at the power of the storms in the Midwest over the last few days. It's unreal. And to look at the way nature works together, to look at the way the body works. That portion of the psalm, and that portion of the psalm really is talking specifically about nature. But you think about Romans 1:20, we talked about that a little bit. That men are without excuse. We ought to be able to look at creation and go, this got here somehow. This is not an accident. This did not just happen. And then beginning in verse 7, it goes on to God's more specific revelation, which is what? His Word. He talks about, Psalm 19 is a real good, beginning in verse 7 down through the rest of the chapter is a really good companion to Psalm 119 that is all about God's Word. That God chose to not only reveal himself to us in nature, but then got very specific and said, here it is. Here's what I want you to know. Here's who I am. Here's everything you need to know about me in order for us to have a good relationship. And we talked a little bit about this last week, but one of the things, I don't know if I mentioned, but one of the things that I believe is monumental or is foundational for us to have to accept. The Bible is a revelation of who God is, but it's not just there to inform us. The Bible, and this is, I don't know if I made this up or not, but I've said this a lot lately. The Bible isn't supposed to be just informational. It's supposed to be transformational. Because what we're supposed to do is look to God's Word, see who He is, see what His plan is for us, and then go, okay, so I need to adapt my life to what He says because of who He is. But again, it all comes down to the fact that God communicated that to us. God didn't have to do that. God could have said, I'm going to pick and choose who gets to come to heaven randomly. But He didn't. He said, I'm going to give you a specific revelation of who I am and what I expect. And again, that all comes down to communication. But God's highest form of communication, nature, the written word, but His highest form of communication was what? Sending His Son. We talked about Hebrews 1, the first 3 verses, that in the past God communicated with us through prophets and the people of old, but now He communicates with us through His Son. And I mean, you tie that into John 1 through 14. In the beginning was the Word, the Logos, the knowledge, the information about God, and then down to verse 14, that Word became flesh. So God has taken the initiative in communicating to us. He does it better than any of us ever will. But that then should lead us to say, again, going back to the idea of we're all created in the image of God, we need to learn to communicate as well as God does. I mean, like I said, we're not going to attain that. But, so we have to go back to us. God has chosen to communicate. It's different. But God even has initiated two-way communication. I mean, His Word is His revelation to us. Nature is His revelation to us. Jesus was His revelation to us. But then He allows us to communicate with Him through prayer. So the idea of two-way communication is a God-given concept. So our challenge then, and this is really the gist of this 2 weeks, is how do we learn to do this well? Our job, and again, we go back to James, our job is to learn how to do this the right way. Learn how to tame the tongue, hold our tongue, I guess. Turn over to James chapter 3. And this is where we're going to kind of park a little bit for a few minutes this morning. Totally skipped over a couple things, but that's okay. You don't know that. We talked about this last week, but if we choose to not speak for a day, I'm not going to talk to anybody. I'm going to go to work. I'm going to go home. I'm mad about whatever. Are we going to communicate? Yeah. We don't choose whether or not we communicate. We choose how we communicate. We choose what we communicate. Our speech, and this is another one of those God-given things. Our speech can either be a blessing to the people around us, or we can injure the people around us. And that's just how it goes. James chapter 3 tells us some information that we've probably learned through just experience. But, James is kind of the Proverbs of the New Testament. Kind of just, here's some good ideas about how to live life. Look at James chapter 3, beginning in verse 2. He says, "For we all stumble in many ways. If anyone does not stumble in what he says, he is mature, able to control the whole body. Now, if we put bits in the mouths of horses so that they obey us, we direct their whole bodies. And consider ships. Though very large and driven by fierce winds, they are guided by a very small rudder, wherever the will of the pilot directs. So too, though the tongue is a small part of the body, it boasts great things. Consider how a small fire sets ablaze a large forest, and the tongue is a fire. The tongue, a world of unrighteousness, is placed among our members. It stains the whole body, sets the course of life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell." Well, that's encouraging. I mean, when you start through that, he does the bit in the horse's mouth and the ship rudder thing, and you're like, oh yeah, I get. And then he goes, and that's what the tongue is. A little bitty thing controls the whole person, and then he goes into the desperation of it all. But what he's saying, I believe, is that our speech, the way we talk, isn't neutral. I mean, what I mean by that is, how many have you ever heard somebody who is abusive with their language, maybe talks about other people too much, and somebody goes, well, that's just how they are. Is that just how they are, or is that a choice? Well, it's obviously a choice. I mean, it's something. I mean, and that's why James uses those analogies. The bit controls the whole animal, but you can control the bit. The rudder controls the whole entire ship, but someone can control the rudder. And then he talks about the tongue. We don't just talk and just go, oh well, that's just that's how I am. I just say things like that. How is our speech formed? Where does our speech come from? Out of the Luke chapter 6. Turn over there. Listen, let's go on here through this. The whole idea is that our character is reflected in our speech. Verse 7, James goes on. Turn over to Luke chapter 6, but listen to James 3:7. "Every kind of animal, bird, reptile, and fish is tamed and has been tamed by humankind, but no one can tame the tongue. It is a restless evil, full of deadly poison." Now, maybe James is using hyperbole here to make the point, but he's saying, consider the damage that is done by the tongue. I mean, you consider, like we went last year, 2 years ago, through Oregon, where the fires were around Multnomah Falls and all that stuff, and everything was closed. That was started by one kid playing with firecrackers. It's like a little spark takes up the whole place. And that's exactly the idea James is trying to get across with our tongues. How many times in any relationship, you're at work, coworker comes up to you and says, hey, I want to see if you were done with that project. Just want to see how you're coming along. And you turn and go, blah, 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 and you spout out something, and there's anger for days. I mean, it happens because the tongue, I mean, that's exactly what James is saying. But he doesn't leave us there, which is the encouraging part. Skip down if you're still there. If not, listen. Beginning in verse 13. "Who among you, though, is wise and understanding? By his good conduct, he should show that his works are done in the gentleness that comes from wisdom. If you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your heart, don't boast and deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where there is envy and selfish ambition, there is disorder and every evil practice, but the wisdom from above is first pure, then peace-loving, gentle, compliant, full of mercy and good fruits, unwavering, without pretense. And the fruit of righteousness is sown in peace by those who cultivate peace." So he says we can't control the tongue. You're gonna. I mean, it's like a raging fire. It's all this stuff. But then he makes the point that you have two choices. You have the motivation from your speech can come from earthly wisdom. Maybe that would be better said earthly thinking, or heavenly wisdom, heavenly thinking, spiritual thinking. Now, that's exactly what Jesus says in the verses that Adam just referenced. Luke chapter 6. Somebody read Luke 6, 43 through 45, please. Through 45, Luke 6.
For no good tree bears bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit. For each tree is known by its own fruit. For figs are not gathered from thorn bushes, nor are grapes from the bramble bush. The good person out of the good of the treasure of his heart produces good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure produces evil. For out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks.
Okay, so when we talk about this idea of controlling what we say, what does Jesus say here? What's the key to controlling your mouth? Is it speech therapy? Is it continuing education courses and being great orators? What's the key?
Filling your heart with good things.
Make sure your heart is in the right place. Whatever controls your heart controls you. That's what Jesus is saying. That's what James went on to say. He's talking about that unrighteousness produces unrighteous speech. Righteousness produces all these other good things, the things that we should be sharing, the things that we should be talking about. When our thoughts are full of bitterness and anger and jealousy, whatever, it's going to be reflected in our speech. If, again, your work situation, a coworker comes up and says, well, old Bob got a promotion. I hate that guy. He's a bad worker. He didn't deserve it. What your speech just showed that what's in your heart is jealousy and bitterness. Instead of, oh, good for Bob. Great for him. Still don't like it. No, you don't. But it's reflected. What you say is reflected in it reflects what's actually in your heart. When we think about the skill of communication, I mean, it is a skill, but the Bible makes it clear that it's not just a skill; it's a responsibility, because you're going to communicate. I mean, even if you choose to not speak, you're still going to communicate. We've talked about that, but what the Bible stresses is in our speech, that communication, that we have to be really careful how we do that, and it's something that we're expected to work on. When James says you can't tame the tongue, he's not saying that to bring us to despair and to make us go, well, great, I just got whatever I say, I just can't help it. I mean, and that's one of those things that I don't know if. I mean, it's one of those verses you could rip out of context and say, well, yeah, I talk the way I talk because I just can't tame my tongue. That's in the Bible. I can't tame my tongue, but that's not what he says. Yeah, I think it's some of both of those ideas. What Blake said is, you think maybe what James is saying is that once your tongue says that stuff, it sparks that fire or it creates that bad situation. Yes, I think that's true, but I think you go into verse 13 through the end there we read, that he's also saying you can't control your tongue unless you're putting in yourself righteousness, unless you're striving to be righteous. What I think James is really saying, I think he's using, like I said, using hyperbole, using an exaggeration to make sure we're conscious of the way we speak, the way we talk to each other. And the fact is, we need help. We need help learning how to speak to each other. We need help learning how to listen. One of the things I asked you last week as we were wrapping up is to look and see, because I was curious, and I should have done it last week before class, but are there resources for you to go find to learn how to listen? Did anybody have a chance? I mean, did you take a chance to look for anything like that? Like, is there a course at CWI, how to be a better listener.
Well, it's a degree in social work, and that is a lot of listening, how to listen, and how to ask the right questions to gather more information. So
Yeah.
I have a degree in listening.
The listening degree. Well, anybody see anything else?
I remember in my early work career, we had an 8-hour course on what's called your inside voice, and how well what was inside my voice matched my body language outside.
Oh yeah,
To your point, it's not always about the speech; it's how you react, eye roll, and
absolutely.
everything else involved with it.
Yeah, and in business, in management positions, that's one of those things that I discovered as I looked, that the art of listening and communicating is something that a lot of corporations are putting in their management places, because yeah, you can balance the books, you can manage people, but somebody comes to you with a problem and you're going, yeah, okay, well, take care of it, see ya. I mean, then that puts everything in a negative situation. Blake.
I was also going to say, like, the upper level English courses or linguistics courses, you go into, like, the mechanical ways of speaking and focusing on how someone speaks, and I guess in turn with that, you learn how to listen better because you're paying more attention to how someone speaks, what they're saying,
Excellent segue. One of the things, I've made a list for you if anyone's interested, is I just looked for ways to listen. And one of the things that I found was, I don't know if it's on this one, I've turned into kind of I like to watch TED Talks as long as they're short enough and can keep my attention. But, yeah, I don't listen well. But one of the ones that I listened to was talking about literature, that one of the ways that people are training in business management is having people sit and listen to different forms of literature and having them just talk about it, not necessarily analyze it, but just kind of talk about it, and gauging their responses, whether it's like reading from Robinson Crusoe or reading Follow the House of Usher, or reading different types of literature, whether it's poems or whatever, and gauging how they respond to it, and how people react physically and emotionally when they're listening to that stuff being read. So anyway, here's a list of 4 of them. This guy, Julian Treasure, 5 Ways to Listen Better. That was a TED Talk. It was actually kind of interesting because as he was talking, he had like different noises going on that, how you listen above just white noise. He called it pink noise, though. I was like, never heard that expression before. I never heard that. And then talking about how you listen in a crowd, and all of a sudden there's crowd noise going on around him. That's kind of interesting. But this second one, which I Googled learning to listen, and this one popped up, and I thought, oh, I'll check that. This was a high school girl talking about how to learn to listen to classical music. And at first I was like, that's not what I'm talking about, but I listened to it a little bit. But a lot of the same principles apply. She was saying you have to first engage. You have to decide, I'm going to listen to this. And that you have to put aside your predispositions. And I was like, that's listening, whether you're learning to listen to a kind of music or whatever. And then another one is, I don't know what these 2 are, I can't remember. Oh, educational leadership. That was kind of some of the same ideas. But these are here if you have any interest and would like to look at those. Because that's the thing, is that we train people. I went to a school of preaching where they teach you how to speak. They teach you how to speak publicly. They teach you how to speak organized. Let's leave that alone. But there was no class about how to listen. We didn't have to sit through hours and hours of learning how to listen. Maybe that's something we ought to have to do. But the idea of learning to listen is just as important as the idea of learning how to keep our mouths shut sometimes. And actually, they go hand in hand. That when we're dealing with communication with our spouses, dealing with communication with our family members, we have to learn to listen to each other. And sometimes it's over the pink noise of a disagreement. I mean, it may be a topic that you feel very strongly about, but we still have to learn to listen. We still have to learn to just sometimes just be quiet, be quick to listen, and slow to speak. Because that's very foundational. Oh, this other thing. Where'd it go? Oh, well, I had some other things that learning to listen things, but I learned to lose them. Oh, here it is. This I thought was kind of interesting. This is an idea about mindful listening. And this is, I don't remember what the website was. This was a website that is geared to communications. How to be a mindful listener. Number one, pay attention. And you almost think, well, of course, yeah, you got to pay attention. But give the speaker your undivided attention. Look at the speaker directly. Put aside distracting thoughts. Don't mentally prepare a rebuttal. I mean, I don't know if that's a guy thing, but I think it's a human thing. Because how many times you've been sitting there listening to somebody, your spouse, your parents, whoever, and they're talking, and in your mind, you're hearing them go, because what you're thinking is, well, the answer to that question is this, and I'm going to, as soon as you shut up, I'm going to tell you. I mean, we have to not do that. And like I said, pay attention seems so obvious. Number two, show that you're listening. Use your body language and gestures to show that you're engaged. Nod occasionally. Smile and use other facial expressions. Make sure that your posture is open and interested. Encourage the speaker to continue with small verbal comments like yes and uh-huh. Now, again, that sounds so cheesy, but okay, see Adam right then? Verbally uh-huh, but he was looking over here. And that actually, there was a whole paragraph in there in this thing about don't do that and be like drawing or something. Uh-huh. Yep. Mm-hmm. And the other person has left already, But I this is one of those things that to me is, I guess sometimes I look at this from a different perspective. I'll tell you that when I'm preaching somewhere, whether it's here or, wherever, and you have an audience that you can look at and see them kind of nod, and, it's very rare some places, but the actual amen every now and then, or a mm-hmm, that as a speaker, that's, we interviewed in Sacramento several years ago, and from the moment, within minutes after getting off the plane, we knew we weren't going to take the job, and there's a whole story behind this whole deal, but anyway, once we met the congregation and Sunday morning preaching, they were very responsive, very active listening. And I was like, okay, maybe we could live in that awful house. No, I'm just, but it was, you start to, it's a different, when you can tell that the person you're talking to is listening, it's incredibly encouraging. Even, obviously, even on a one-on-one basis. So show that you're speaking, provide feedback. And we talked about this some last week. Reflect on what the other person has said by asking, what I'm hearing sounds like you're saying, is this what you mean? Good ideas. Then the fourth thing, defer judgment. And again, that kind of goes back to that, trying to decide what you're going to respond to while they're still talking. Allow the speaker to finish each point before asking questions. Don't interrupt with counter arguments. And that's so hard. Maybe that's just me talking, but we have to learn to just let the person listen and respond, or let the person talk. Respond appropriately. Be candid, honest in your response. Assert your opinions respectfully. Treat the other person in a way that you think they would want to be treated. This is a businessy approach, but isn't that biblical? Treat the other person the way you want to be treated. Be quick to hear, slow to speak. That's what that's saying. So all these principles that are becoming pretty mainstream, and whether it's education or business or whatever, and maybe they've always been, but they're kind of making a resurface, it seems like. They've been in the Bible forever.
Well, there's a difference, I learned this a long time ago, there's a difference between hearing and listening.
Yeah, absolutely.
A conversation, and I learned it with my wife kind of the hard way. I hear every word she says, but sometimes I don't listen to what she's saying.
Yep.
And it'll always come back later, it's like, we just talked about that.
Man, Dave, that is so weird. That is so unusual.
Yeah, our everyday lives where there's a switch.
Yeah.
We just kind of flip the switch and we hear it, but we hear noise.
Yep.
We don't really listen to what's being said or look at the body language or anything else.
Yeah, and that's all part of the whole idea of engaging and being that active listening. You know, Jesus, when Jesus was in different situations, I think in Luke 7, when he's the home of Simon the Pharisee, and he knows what Simon's thinking, and he there's this woman who's a sinful woman or whatever, and Jesus engages Simon and says, Simon, do you see this woman? Was his question, Simon, are you blind? No, it was a question to engage him in the situation, to make him respond. And I guess the point of that is when we're in a conversation, when we're in a discussion with somebody, sometimes the way to engage each other is just that, is to make sure that we know we're both talking about the same thing. Man, way behind here. So this whole idea, man, I had discussion questions and everything. One of the things that, as Dave just said, that there's a huge difference between hearing and listening. What does the expression "speak your mind" mean? I'm going to speak my mind. You don't care about the consequences. You're just going to say. What I should have asked is, when you hear the expression, I'm going to speak my mind, do you get a positive or a negative reaction? Negative. I'm just going to speak my mind. That means stand back. If someone says, as the listener, well, I'm just going to hear him out, positive or negative? I guess it depends on how it's said. When I hear that, what it means is I'm going to let him finish using all his words because I don't really care what they're saying. I'm going to hear him out. To be effective communicators, to be good listeners, good communicators, we can't have either of those approaches, whether it's in our relationships, definitely spiritually. You think of Isaiah. God told Isaiah in Isaiah 6, 9, and 10, you're going to go talk to people, you're going to speak, and they're not going to understand. You're going to show them things, they're not going to believe it. So Isaiah, that's his rah-rah speech. You're going to go say all this stuff, and people aren't going to get it. Think about Jesus and his parables. When the apostles asked him about, in Matthew 13, after the parable of the sower, they're like, we don't get this. And he goes, yes, some people won't. And they're like, so why are you telling all these stories? But the point is, thinking about communication for us on a spiritual level, let's shift over to dealing with other people on spiritual matters. We can't just speak our mind spiritually. If somebody at work, somebody in your family, some connection to your family says, I don't get your whole religious beliefs, can we talk about that? That's your opportunity to open the scriptures to them and show them the truth. And they might, in fact, they probably will go, I don't get that. I don't get why you people do this. I don't get why you do that. That is not your opening to speak your mind. Your opportunity there is to show them the truth. Jesus dealt with it. Prophets dealt with it. The fact is, if people are open to the truth, they're going to hear it. If you show somebody the Bible and they reject it, they're rejecting God, not you. That goes back to Samuel and Saul. When God says, give them a king if they want a king. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. Our objective is to speak our objective is not to speak our mind. Our objective is to plant seeds. And when someone has a question, when someone has an argument about a spiritual matter, our job also there is not just to hear them out, to sit there and go, okay, I get your argument. Okay, when you're done, we'll get back to the Bible here. I mean, we have to be effective listeners on spiritual matters also. And I'll admit, this is hard for me. When I'm discussing spiritual things with people, Bible stuff with people, it's hard for me to not just go, oh yeah, stop, let me just tell you what's right. Which is incredibly ineffective. Because what one person is saying, if the other person is hearing, I mean, all we're getting is garble stuff in the middle. Adam.
When I teach classes and someone brings up a point or has a discussion, oftentimes they actually call me out. I'll gloss over because I'm thinking, okay, what do I say after this? How do I? Because it's really hard for me when I have a train of thought and plan what we're going to go and where the class is going to go, and someone brings up a topic for me to incorporate that. It's really difficult. And good teachers do that well. When someone brings up a topic, they're taking that topic and incorporating it into the rest of the class. They're listening well.
Yeah.
I don't do that.
If you didn't hear what Adam said, this is absolutely true. Teaching a class, and it is. It's you know what's helped me? This. Seriously. When we're live streaming classes and you're supposed to listen and then repeat it, it's like I had to sit there and listen to what you were saying. But it's hard, and it goes back from whether it's classroom or personal study, that you know what you want to teach this, but you know you want to share the truth of the gospel with somebody, and they go, well, yeah, but in Revelation 13 there's the beast, and you go, we can't do that. We have to go, okay, I get that. You have to engage that and go, let's deal with that at some point or whatever. This is the last thing, I'll let you go. Where'd it go? Here's what it comes down to. Do you communicate without trying, or do you try without communicating? Because I'll confess, I find myself a lot of times trying to get a point across without really communicating. Effective communicators communicate, and I won't even say without trying because we have to try. But and it goes from personal one-on-one relationships to big situations, whether it's classrooms or personal Bible studies. We have to be willing to listen as well as communicate what God wants us to say. Any thoughts? People are starting to storm the castle here. So, all right, we'll pick up next week. Here's these things.